Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are completely unpacking a truly chaotic, yet absolutely brilliant time in history, the 14th century. We're going to be focusing on the entire age of Chaucer. Now, this is a relatively short period, spanning roughly from 1350 to 1450, but let me tell you, it completely transformed the literary landscape. This is the exact era where the English language finally shook off its awkward, transitional growing pains and found a standard, enduring form, the very voice we still use today.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with A World in Turmoil, then look at how English finds its voice. After that, we'll meet Geoffrey Chaucer, dive into the Canterbury masterpiece, and finally wrap things up with ballads, prose, and allegory. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. A World in Turmoil. We really have to start our story in a time of just unprecedented social and political upheaval. Honestly, you simply cannot understand the literature of this era without wrapping your head around the sheer scale of the historical events that were pressing down on the people living through it.
Just look at the macro world from 1350 to 1450. It was a century literally forged in trauma. You had endless conflicts, specifically Edward III's long, grinding French wars. Add to that these massive dynastic revolutions, which ultimately culminated in the deposition of Richard II in 1399 and the sudden rise of the Lancastrians. It was, for sure, an incredibly unstable time to be alive, and that deep instability completely permeated the minds of the writers who were observing it all unfold.
But honestly, perhaps nothing shaped this era quite like the terrible plague known as the Black Death. Out of this massive wave of plague and the severe poverty that followed it came deep, widespread social unrest. This famously boiled right over into the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. And this wasn't just a physical struggle in the streets, it created a much sharper spirit of intellectual criticism. People were done just quietly accepting the status quo. You had thinkers like Wycliffe and poets like Langland actively challenging these long-established systems of faith and power, basically demanding actual accountability from untouchable institutions like the church.
Section 2. English finds its voice. So out of all this immense chaos comes a pretty surprising plot twist. Right in the middle of all the death and dynastic rebellion, our language actually stabilizes. The absolute crucial point to grasp here is that during this specific period, English basically stopped being this fractured, messy collection of regional dialects. The East Midlands speech, which happened to be the language of the capital city London and the major universities, stepped up to become the new standard. It finally shook off its clunky phase and permanently amalgamated the fancy French vocabulary of the Norman conquerors with the gritty native English sentence structures. The result? Well, it's the very words you and I are using in this explainer right now. If we contrast the old era with the new one, the differences are pretty staggering. Back in the old era, literature was totally dominated by these highly idealized romances, a sort of unquestioning, childlike faith in the established order, and of course, the heavy dominance of Latin and French. But the Chaucerian age, it brings a totally different flavor. It's marked by this sharper, much more searching interest in mankind's actual day-to-day affairs. The dreaming romances begin to pass away, and they're replaced by acute observation, a truly modern note, and of course, this brand new East Midlands Standard English.
Section 3. Meet Geoffrey Chaucer. To really understand how this newly stabilized language was mastered, we have to introduce the era's undisputed literary superstar. This is the guy who literally gave this entire age its name, Geoffrey Chaucer.
And let me be clear, Geoffrey Chaucer wasn't just some dusty, boring poet locked away in a tower somewhere. He was the ultimate people watcher. Born around 1340, his life was incredibly diverse, which perfectly positioned him to capture raw human nature. Get this. He was a soldier who actually got captured abroad in France. He was a diplomat sent on high-stakes missions to Italy, which exposed him firsthand to the cutting-edge European Renaissance. He worked right in the royal household as a pensioner, weathering all the crazy political storms of the day. And ultimately, his massive contribution to our language made him the very first poet ever to be buried in what we now know as Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey.
His writing career completely mirrors those wild, worldly adventures. Scholars generally break his evolution down into 3 distinct stages. First, you have the French stage, where he was heavily influenced by courtly models, doing things like translating the Rolement of the Rose. Then comes the Italian stage, which was a direct result of his diplomatic trips. This is where he discovers writers like Boccaccio and develops a much deeper psychological subtlety and some seriously advanced metrical techniques. Finally, he breaks completely into his own in the English stage. This is where he becomes incredibly original, highly realistic, and just profoundly human.
Now, one thing that makes Chaucer feel so incredibly modern to us today is his humor.
In a time when literature could be super dense and heavy, he possessed this delightfully urbane, almost self-deprecating wit. For instance, he'd literally write himself into his own dream allegories. In The House of Fame, he hilariously describes himself as a character being physically swept up into the sky by this giant talkative eagle with feathers all of gold. The guy absolutely wasn't afraid to poke fun at his own expense.
But right beneath that witty exterior lay a really profound emotional depth. We see this masterfully in his Italian-influenced tragedy, Troilus and Cresside. Just look at this passionate, deeply questioning stanza. If no love is, O God, what feel I so? And if love is, what thing and which is he? He is exploring the complex, often totally contradictory psychology of human motives in a way that simply hadn't ever been done in the English language before.
Section 4. The Canterbury Masterpiece. All of that incredible worldly experience, from the battlefields of France to the diplomatic halls of Italy, and all of that linguistic evolution we've talked about, it all climaxed in his ultimate, crowning achievement.
29. That number represents the incredibly diverse group of pilgrims he gathered at the Tabard Inn in Southwark. To set up the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer brought together 29 characters, plus himself acting as the narrator, all heading to the tomb of Thomas à Becket. And this was a stroke of absolute genius. Why? Because it allowed him to showcase this wide slice of humanity across every single social rank. He gave us the noble knight, the coarse miller, the worldly wife of Bath, the humble plowman, all interacting and clashing in one shared space.
The sheer scale of what he intended to pull off was just staggering. His grand plan was to have each of these pilgrims tell 2 stories on the way to Canterbury and then 2 more stories on the way back. Do the math, and that's well over 100 tales. The reality, though, well, he only actually finished 20 before his death, with 4 more left partly complete. But here's the thing, even in its incomplete state, it is basically a small literature all in itself. It's an unmatched collection of pathos, humor, and narrative brilliance that was more than enough to define the entire age.
Even unfinished, the man's legacy is absolutely towering. From a purely technical standpoint, he virtually imported the decasyllabic, or heroic couplet, into English, establishing a poetic rhythm that writers would rely on for centuries to come. He mastered this stealthy, super rapid narrative speed that just keeps the reader completely hooked. And above all else, he injected an unprecedented level of human observation, urbanity, and varied humor. He stands entirely alone. Honestly, no one even dared to challenge his literary equality for hundreds of years.
Section 5. Ballads, Prose, and Allegory. Now, as massive as Chaucer's shadow was, he wasn't the only literary game in town during this highly transformative century. The English language was stretching its legs in a few other really fascinating directions as well.
There was a really sharp cultural divide happening in the 14th century. On one hand, you had the high culture's aristocratic romance. These were usually pretty long-winded, featuring these idealized supermen going on endless, cumulative adventures. But down among the lower classes, a totally new form of entertainment was taking off: the popular ballad. These were punchy, fast-paced, and deeply emotional tales about commoners, outlaws like Robin Hood, and local legends. They dealt with raw, elemental passions in a frank, totally uninhibited way that was completely different from those stuffy, courtly romances.
At the exact same time, everyday English prose was rapidly expanding and really finding its footing. It was moving way beyond just dry, official Latin texts. We start seeing the emergence of prose written purely for fun, like Mandeville's highly popular and, let's be honest, often totally fantastical travel writings. We see Wycliffe's monumental translation of the Bible, which actually brought scripture directly into the vernacular. And perhaps most importantly, we see vibrant, straightforward, everyday English showing up in civic records and in the personal letters of common people, like the famous Paston letters. The native idiom was suddenly being used by everyone, not just the elite.
And we can't forget that this was still the era of allegory. Even with all this growing realism, the medieval minds still absolutely loved to use allegory. They relied heavily on these dream visions to make really complex moral and abstract religious ideas concrete and highly visible to the audience. People were totally captivated by these symbolic journeys into courts of love or houses of fame, where abstract concepts like vice or virtue or fame were treated as actual living characters you could walk up to and speak with.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought to chew on. We've seen how the entire age of Chaucer moved from plague and absolute chaos to stunning clarity, quite literally forging the very language we speak right now.
Chaucer achieved his greatness not by ignoring the messy world around him, but by keenly observing the incredibly diverse everyday pilgrims he bumped into. Since we are literally still using his foundational language over 600 years later, how are you capturing the diverse human stories happening around you? What pilgrims are you observing to understand the true spirit of our own age?